The laughter echoed off crystal chandeliers and marble columns. 12-year-old Nalani Carter stood beside the $300,000 Steinway concert grand piano, her small hands trembling slightly as 500 of Boston's wealthiest elite stared at her like she was a circus act. "Go ahead, little girl," Damian Sterling said, his voice carrying across the Westfield Grand Theater with calculated amusement. "Show us what you've got. Maybe play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star or whatever they teach orphans these days." The audience erupted in polite laughter, the kind that came easy to people who'd never known poverty, never felt invisible, never understood what it meant to have nothing but a dream and the desperate courage to reach for it anyway. Nalani adjusted the piano bench to accommodate her 4'9" frame. Her worn sneakers barely touched the floor. The second-hand dress she wore, navy blue and 2 sizes too big, donated to Riverside Home for Girls by someone's grandmother who'd died, hung loose on her thin shoulders. Comment where you're watching from if you've ever been underestimated. Mrs. Patricia Monroe, the orphanage director, stood in the wings with 9 other girls from Riverside, her face tight with barely contained fury. She'd explicitly told Nalani not to speak, not to draw attention, not to embarrass them in front of potential donors. But Nalani had broken the rule. Had asked, no, begged, to play this piano. And now Mrs. Monroe could do nothing but watch as a 12-year-old potentially destroyed relationships with wealthy benefactors by wasting their time. Damian Sterling settled back into his front-row seat, crossing his legs with casual confidence. At 47 years old, the tech billionaire had built an empire worth $3 billion. He'd given keynote speeches at conferences worldwide. He'd been featured on magazine covers. He'd dated supermodels and dined with presidents. A charity auction for orphans was merely an obligation, tax-deductible generosity that let him feel magnanimous while networking with other wealthy donors. He certainly hadn't expected entertainment from a scrawny black girl in a dress that looked like it came from a thrift store. Nalani placed her fingers on the keys. Cool ivory beneath her fingertips. 6 months since she'd last touched a piano, 6 months since the upright at Riverside had broken beyond repair and nobody cared enough to fix it. 6 months of practicing in her mind, playing silent sonatas on imaginary keys, hearing music that existed only in memory. She closed her eyes. Thought of her mother. Elise Carter, with her warm smile and patient hands guiding Nalani's fingers across keys when she was just 5 years old. "Music isn't about the notes, baby," her mother used to say. "It's about the story you tell between them. The spaces where silence speaks louder than sound." Nalani began to play. The first notes came soft, a delicate melody that whispered rather than announced itself. Her right hand carried the theme while her left provided gentle harmonic support. The piece was called Promise, an original composition her mother had written but never published. Nalani had found the sheet music in a box after her mother died, tucked between performance programs and old photographs. For 3 measures, the audience continued their muted conversations. Checking phones. Adjusting jewelry. Sipping champagne. Then the melody shifted. Nalani's fingers moved faster, more complex. The right hand climbed the register in arpeggiated patterns that required precision and emotional control. The left hand introduced countermelodies that wove through the primary theme like threads in fabric. The dynamics swelled from pianissimo to mezzo forte, building tension. Conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the stage. Damian Sterling leaned forward, his smug expression faltering. The piece evolved into its second movement, technically demanding, emotionally devastating. Nalani's small hand stretched octaves that should have been impossible for her reach. She used pedal techniques that took years to master, creating sustained harmonies that layered like watercolors bleeding into each other. Her fingers flew across the keys in passages that would challenge concert pianists twice her age. But it wasn't the technical skill that made the audience freeze. It was the emotion. Every note carried weight. Grief and hope intertwined. Loss and resilience fighting for dominance. The music told a story, of a mother who knew she was dying, writing a promise to the daughter she'd have to leave behind. A promise that love survives death. That beauty persists through suffering. That some bonds cannot be broken by mortality. Nalani played with her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't performing for the audience anymore. She was playing for her mother. For every night she'd cried herself to sleep in foster homes where nobody knew her name. For every moment she'd felt invisible and worthless and forgotten. For every time someone had looked at her, a black orphan girl with nothing and nobody, and decided she wasn't worth attention. The music said, I exist. I matter. My mother's love made me someone, even if the world can't see it. In the front row, Damian Sterling's eyes filled with tears he couldn't control. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the armrests. Something about this piece, the melody, the harmonic structure, the emotional architecture, felt familiar. Impossibly familiar. Like a memory from a life he'd abandoned decades ago. Around him, the audience sat in stunned silence. Women dabbed eyes with expensive handkerchiefs. Men cleared throats to hide emotion. The cynical laughter from minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by the humbling recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Nalani reached the final movement. The melody returned to its opening theme, but transformed. What began as whisper now sang with confidence. The harmonies that once seemed fragile now felt unbreakable. She used the full range of the piano, bass notes that resonated through the theater's wooden floor, treble notes that hung in the air like stars. The final chord came, a major seventh that resolved into a pure major triad, sustained with pedal until the overtones faded into silence. Nalani lifted her hands from the keys. Opened her eyes. For 10 seconds, maybe 15, the theater remained absolutely silent. 500 people holding their breath. Then the applause erupted. Thunderous. Standing ovation. People crying openly, not caring about dignity or decorum. The sound washed over Nalani like a wave, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt visible. Seen. Recognized as something more than an obligation or charity case or invisible child. Damian Sterling stood, walking toward the stage with unsteady steps. His face was wet with tears he hadn't bothered to hide. He reached Nalani, dropped to one knee so they were eye level. Who taught you to play like that? His voice cracked with emotion. My mother, Nalani said quietly. She was a concert pianist. Elise Carter. She died 5 years ago in a car accident. She wrote that piece, Promise, before she died. It's the only thing I have left of her. Damian Sterling's face went pale. The color drained from his skin like someone had opened a valve. He grabbed Nalani's shoulders, not roughly, but with desperate intensity. Subscribe now, what he says next will blow your mind. Elise Carter was your mother? His voice barely above a whisper. That's impossible. I knew Elise Carter. We went to music school together. We were best friends. And the song you just played, Promise, I've heard it before. She played it for me once. 20 years ago. Before you were even born. The theater spun. Nalani stared at this billionaire stranger whose tears looked exactly like grief. You knew my mother. I loved your mother, Damian said, the words torn from somewhere deep. Not romantically, like a sister. She was my best friend in the world. And when I graduated, I abandoned music. I abandoned her. I never saw her again. I didn't know she had a daughter. I didn't know she died. He looked at Nalani like she was a ghost made flesh. You just played her promise to me. The promise I broke. And now you're here, orphaned, forgotten, playing it again like the universe is giving me a chance I don't deserve. Behind them, Mrs. Monroe hurried onto the stage, sensing a wealthy donor becoming emotionally compromised. But Damian held up a hand, stopping her. How long have you been at the orphanage? 5 years, Nalani said. Since the accident. And nobody, his voice broke. Nobody adopted you. Nobody saw that you're extraordinary. Nalani shook her head. Damien Sterling made a decision that would change both their lives. You're not going back to that orphanage. I'm taking you home with me tonight. I'm going to adopt you. I owe that to Elise. I owe that to you. Mrs. Monroe's eyes lit up with calculation even as she feigned concern. Mr. Sterling, adoption is a complex process requiring significant paperwork and fees. Perhaps we should discuss the orphanage's financial needs first. The backstage area of the Westfield Grand Theater smelled like expensive perfume and aging wood. Nalani sat on a velvet couch in the green room while Damien Sterling paced back and forth, his $3,000 shoes wearing patterns into the Persian rug. Mrs. Monroe hovered near the door like a hawk protecting territory, her practiced smile barely concealing the calculations running behind her eyes. Tell me about Berkeley, Nalani said quietly. About my mother. What was she like before I was born? Damien stopped pacing, ran his hands through his salt and pepper hair. She was brilliant. And terrifying. The kind of talent that made everyone else question why they bothered trying. He sat down across from Nalani, leaning forward with intensity. I met Elise during freshman orientation at Berklee College of Music 25 years ago. I was this rich kid from Cambridge whose parents thought music school would give me purpose. She was there on a full scholarship, working 3 jobs to afford textbooks and rent in a basement apartment in Allston that probably violated 6 building codes. She never told me she struggled like that, Nalani whispered. Because she didn't want you to carry her burdens. Damien's voice softened. But I saw it. Everyone saw it. While the rest of us were sleeping until noon and partying on weekends, Elise was practicing 8 hours a day, taking extra shifts at a coffee shop, and still somehow maintaining a perfect GPA. She should have been exhausted all the time. Instead, she seemed unstoppable. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through photos until he found one from decades ago, yellowed with age but digitally preserved. Look. This was us at graduation. The photo showed a younger Damien in a cap and gown, his arm around a beautiful black woman with Nalani's exact eyes and bone structure. Elise Carter wore the same graduation robes, but her smile carried something beyond happiness, triumph mixed with relief mixed with determination. Comment where you're watching from if this story is touching your heart. She composed Promise during our senior year, Damien continued. We were in the practice rooms late one night, I was struggling with a composition assignment I'd probably fail. She sat down at the piano and just started playing. No sheet music. The melody came out like she'd been carrying it inside her for years and finally found permission to release it. What did she say about it? Nalani asked, gripping the edge of the couch. She said, Damien's voice caught. He took a breath, steadied himself. She said it was a promise to herself. That no matter what happened, no matter how hard life got, she'd remember that beauty existed. That music could transform suffering into something transcendent. She made me promise the same thing, that I'd never forget what music could do. What it meant to create something that mattered more than money or status or success. Mrs. Monroe cleared her throat pointedly. Mr. Sterling, this is all very touching, but the girls need to return to Riverside soon. We have a curfew. I broke that promise, Damien continued, ignoring her completely. The day after graduation, my father offered me a position at Sterling Tech. Said music was a nice hobby but it was time to be serious. I took the job. Told myself I'd stay in touch with Elise. But weeks became months became years. I got promoted. Made my first $1 million. Then $10 million. Then 100. I built an empire and convinced myself I was successful. He looked at Nalani with raw grief. I abandoned the only thing that mattered. And I abandoned the friend who understood what that thing was. By the time I thought about reaching out to Elise, I'd lost her contact information. Figured she was performing somewhere, living the dream we'd talked about. I told myself she wouldn't want to hear from someone who'd sold out. She did perform, Nalani said. She played at Carnegie Hall when I was 6. She taught piano to students who couldn't afford lessons. She never got rich, but she was happy. She told me music wasn't about money, it was about touching people's souls in the brief time we have on earth. Damien closed his eyes. That sounds exactly like her. Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Monroe interjected again, more forcefully this time. About the adoption you mentioned. Massachusetts has very strict protocols. Background checks, home studies, financial documentation, psychological evaluations. I'll provide whatever's needed, Damien said immediately. I have lawyers. Resources. Whatever it takes. Mrs. Monroe's smile widened slightly. Of course. The process typically costs between $15,000 and $30,000 in legal fees, agency costs, and required assessments. For someone of your means, that's certainly manageable. However, Riverside Home for Girls operates on a very tight budget. We barely keep the lights on with state funding. If we're going to dedicate staff time to processing your adoption paperwork, handle the transition period, provide counseling services for Nalani during this emotional change. How much? Damien asked bluntly. $50,000. A donation to ensure the other girls at Riverside benefit from your generosity, not just Nalani. It seems only fair. Nalani watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Something felt wrong about how quickly Mrs. Monroe had turned this emotional revelation into a business transaction. How easily she'd attached a price tag to something that should have been about giving a child a home. But Damien just nodded. Done. I'll have my accountant wire the money tomorrow. Wonderful. Mrs. Monroe's entire demeanor shifted to warmth that felt manufactured. There's also the matter of temporary guardianship fees while the adoption processes. Whatever it costs, Damien interrupted. Money isn't the issue. Getting Nalani out of the system is. Over the next hour, they discussed logistics. Nalani would remain at Riverside while paperwork processed, standard procedure, Mrs. Monroe insisted, usually taking 6 to 8 weeks. Damien could visit weekly. He'd pay for any expenses related to Nalani's care during the transition. Piano lessons. New clothes. Whatever she needed. There's one more thing, Damien said as they prepared to leave. He knelt beside Nalani's chair. Your mother made me promise to never forget what music could create. I failed that promise for 20 years. But you kept it for her. You played Promise tonight and reminded me what I'd lost. What I'd thrown away. I didn't mean to make you sad, Nalani said quietly. You didn't make me sad. You made me remember I'm supposed to be human. He squeezed her hand gently. Your mother and I had a bond that death apparently couldn't break. Because she sent you into my life when I'd forgotten who I used to be. That's not coincidence. That's Elise keeping promises even from beyond. Nalani hugged him, this stranger who was becoming something like hope. Thank you for knowing her. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for being brave enough to ask to play that piano. For being so much like your mother it physically hurts to look at you. As Damien left the theater, already on his phone with lawyers to start adoption paperwork, Mrs. Monroe guided the Riverside girls back to the van. Her expression had shifted from performative warmth to cold calculation. You got very lucky tonight, Nalani, she said, her voice low enough that the other girls couldn't hear. A billionaire with a guilty conscience and a sentimental attachment to your dead mother. You played that situation perfectly. I didn't play anything, Nalani protested. I just wanted to play the piano. Save it, Mrs. Monroe snapped. You manipulated him with that sob story about Elise Carter. Now you think you're special. You think you're getting out while the rest of these girls stay stuck. Subscribe, this is about to get much darker. She opened the van door, shoved Nalani inside more roughly than necessary. 6 to 8 weeks of processing, Nalani. A lot can happen in 6 weeks. I suggest you remember that you're still under my care. Still subject to my rules. Still just another orphan nobody really wants. The van pulled away from the theater. Through the window, Nalani watched the Steinway grand piano disappearing into distance, wondering if she'd ever see it, or Damien Sterling, again. And in the driver's seat, Mrs. Monroe pulled out her phone and sent a text message to a contact saved only as V.Hayes, DCF. The message read, "Found another high-value case. Billionaire, emotionally vulnerable, deep pockets. Start the denial paperwork. This one's worth at least $200K. 3 weeks crawled by like years." Nalani scrubbed floors in the Riverside Home for Girls kitchen at 5 a.m., her hands raw from bleach water that Mrs. Monroe insisted she use without gloves. Punishment, though the director never called it that. Just extra responsibilities for girls who drew unnecessary attention to themselves. The other 11 girls at Riverside had turned on her. Not violently, nothing that would leave evidence, but with the casual cruelty that children learn from watching adults. They accidentally knocked her dinner tray to the floor. They hid her homework so she'd get marked absent from school assignments. They whispered "rich man's pet" when she walked past, loud enough to hear but quiet enough to deny if confronted. Nalani endured it silently, counting days until Damien's adoption paperwork finalized. 6 to 8 weeks, Mrs. Monroe had said. 3 weeks down. 3 to 5 more to go. Damien visited every Sunday afternoon, arriving in his Tesla with bags from expensive stores, sheet music, new clothes that actually fit, a portable keyboard so Nalani could practice in her shared bedroom. Each visit, Mrs. Monroe materialized like smoke, intercepting him in the front parlor with new financial requests. Nalani needs psychological counseling to process the adoption transition. The state requires it. $1,500 per session, twice weekly. The other girls feel jealous of Nalani's special treatment. Perhaps you could fund a group outing to help maintain harmony. $5,000 should cover it. Our piano teacher quit unexpectedly. If you want Nalani to continue lessons during the transition, we'll need to hire a private instructor at premium rates. $300 per hour, 3 times per week. Damien wrote checks for everything. He was a billionaire. What was another $20,000? Another $50,000. The money meant nothing compared to honoring Elisa's memory by giving her daughter the life she deserved. What he didn't see was that none of the money reached Nalani. The psychological counseling never happened. The group outing consisted of Mrs. Monroe taking 2 girls to a movie while pocketing the rest. The piano teacher didn't exist. Nalani's keyboard sat silent in the corner of her room, forbidden to touch it after 8 p.m. because the sound disturbed other residents. How much longer? Nalani asked on Damien's 4th visit, sitting across from him in the sparse visiting room while Mrs. Monroe watched from the hallway. My lawyers say the paperwork is moving through channels, Damien said, frustration clear in his voice. Background checks came back clean. Financial documentation approved. Home study scheduled for next week. Should be finalized within 2 more weeks, maybe 3. Do you promise? Nalani's voice came out smaller than she intended. Damien squeezed her hand. I promise. I already let your mother down once. I won't let you down. After he left, Mrs. Monroe called Nalani into her office. The director sat behind a desk covered in files, her expression cold and calculating. Sit down, Nalani. Nalani sat in the wooden chair that faced the desk, hands folded in her lap. You've cost this facility quite a bit of trouble, Mrs. Monroe began, her tone conversational but edged with threat. Drawing attention to yourself at that charity event. Making yourself special. Making the other girls feel inferior. Comment where you're watching from if you've ever dealt with someone like this. I just wanted to play piano. You wanted attention. You got it. And now you think you're better than everyone here. Better than the girls who'll still be here long after you're gone. Better than me, even though I've kept a roof over your head for 5 years when nobody else wanted you. Nalani said nothing. Experience had taught her that arguing only made things worse. Your billionaire savior has been very generous, Mrs. Monroe continued. $150,000 in donations over 3 weeks. Quite impressive. Of course, running a facility like this is expensive. Utilities. Food. Staff salaries. The money he's provided has been helpful, but barely covers the actual costs of housing you and the other girls. She pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk. This arrived yesterday from the Department of Children and Families. Your adoption application status. Nalani's heart hammered. She reached for the folder with shaking hands, opened it. The letterhead read, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Department of Children and Families. Her eyes scanned the text. Key phrases jumped out: application under review, concerns raised regarding, insufficient childcare planning, recommendation for denial pending further evaluation. What does this mean? Nalani whispered. It means Damian Sterling's adoption application is being denied, Mrs. Monroe said, satisfaction creeping into her voice. The state has concerns about his ability to provide adequate parenting given his busy schedule as a CEO. He travels frequently for business. Works 80-hour weeks. Lives in a high-rise penthouse with no yard or play spaces. Has no previous parenting experience and no family support system to help with childcare. But he promised. Rich men promise lots of things, Nalani. Doesn't mean they follow through. Mrs. Monroe leaned back in her chair. However, I've discussed an alternative arrangement with Mr. Sterling. He can become your official sponsor and educational guardian without formal adoption. He'll continue funding your care here at Riverside while paying for private music lessons, academic tutoring, whatever you need. You stay under our supervision, which the state prefers, while he maintains involvement in your development. Everyone wins. Except I stay here, Nalani said, her voice hollow. With you. With a roof over your head, food in your stomach, and a billionaire paying for opportunities most orphans never get. You should be grateful. Mrs. Monroe's smile turned sharp. Unless you prefer we tell Mr. Sterling his involvement is no longer welcome. That the disruption he's causing isn't worth the complications. I'm sure he'd understand. Rich people hate messy situations. The threat was clear: accept this arrangement or lose Damian completely. I'll talk to him on Sunday, Nalani said quietly. Good girl. Mrs. Monroe took the folder back. One more thing. I've received complaints from the other girls about your keyboard. The sound carries through walls, apparently disrupts their sleep. I'm confiscating it until further notice. That's not fair. What's not fair is one girl getting special treatment while others suffer. The keyboard stays in my office. When you've demonstrated better attitude and cooperation, perhaps you'll earn the privilege of having it returned. Nalani left the office fighting tears. Walked upstairs to the bedroom she shared with 3 other girls. The portable keyboard Damian had brought, a Yamaha worth $2,000, with weighted keys and recording capabilities, was gone. Only dust remained where it had sat. That night, Nalani pulled out her mother's sheet music for Promise, hidden under her mattress where Mrs. Monroe couldn't find it. The paper was worn, edges soft from being folded and unfolded hundreds of times. Her mother's handwriting in the margins, notes about tempo, dynamics, emotional intention. On the last page, a message Nalani had memorized years ago: for my daughter, when the world feels dark. Remember, promises are kept not in comfort, but in choosing to believe anyway. Nalani practiced the piece silently, fingers moving against the air above her blanket, hearing the notes in her mind. The melody her mother had written. The promise she'd kept alive through 5 years of foster care, loss, and loneliness. Sunday came. Damien arrived with his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Park who specialized in family law. They sat in the visiting room while Mrs. Monroe stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "The DCF denial doesn't make sense," Catherine was saying. "Your background check is clean. Financials are more than adequate. Home study passed inspection. Every objective measure says you're qualified to adopt. Unless someone is influencing the process," Damien said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Mrs. Monroe interjected smoothly. "The state prioritizes children's best interests, Mr. Sterling. A single man with no parenting experience, working excessive hours, perhaps they simply feel Nalani needs more structured support than you can currently provide. Subscribe, the truth is about to explode. Then I'll quit my job. Hire full-time childcare. Whatever it takes. Or," Mrs. Monroe suggested, "you could accept the sponsorship arrangement. Nalani stays here where she has routine, peer support, professional supervision. You fund her education and enrichment. Less legally complicated. Less disruptive to everyone involved." Catherine Park's expression hardened. "That arrangement would require Mr. Sterling to pay thousands monthly for care Riverside is already state-funded to provide. Why would he agree to that? Because he cares about Nalani's well-being more than money?" Mrs. Monroe's smile didn't reach her eyes. Nalani watched the adults argue about her future like she wasn't in the room. Damien getting angrier. Catherine getting more suspicious. Mrs. Monroe staying calm with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. And suddenly, Nalani understood. This was never about her well-being. It was about keeping the money flowing. Mrs. Monroe had sabotaged the adoption to maintain control. To keep Damien paying indefinitely for care Nalani would never actually receive. Her mother's words echoed, "Promises are kept in choosing to believe anyway." Nalani stood up. "I need to tell you something." Damien Sterling sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor of Sterling Tech headquarters, staring at the official denial letter from the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. Rain streaked down floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston's skyline blurred behind sheets of water that matched his mood perfectly. Insufficient childcare planning. Lack of demonstrated parental experience with children requiring specialized emotional support. Concerns regarding applicants' extensive work travel schedule and limited family support network. Every word felt like a punch. Damien had built a $3 billion company from scratch. He'd navigated hostile takeovers, survived market crashes, made decisions affecting thousands of employees. But apparently, he couldn't be trusted to care for one 12-year-old girl. Catherine Park sat across from him, her laptop open to spreadsheets documenting every interaction with Riverside Home. "Something's wrong with this denial. I've handled 300 family law cases. When DCF has legitimate concerns, they request additional documentation or modified arrangements. They don't issue flat denials on applications this strong." "So what are you saying?" Damien asked. "I'm saying someone wanted this application denied. Someone with influence over the caseworker assigned to your file." Catherine pulled up a name. "Vincent Hayes. He's been with DCF for 12 years. Clean record, no complaints, processes about 50 adoption cases annually. But here's what's interesting, he's denied 7 applications in the past 5 years where the children were from Riverside Home specifically." Damien leaned forward. 7 kids who could have been adopted, but weren't. 7 kids whose potential adoptive parents were wealthy, emotionally invested, and willing to pay significant fees to expedite the process. Catherine showed him the patterns. Each denial came with recommendation for alternative guardianship sponsorship arrangements where the prospective parents paid Riverside directly for continued care while maintaining visitation rights. "Let me guess," Mrs. Monroe suggested those arrangements. "Every single time. And in each case, the sponsor paid between $100,000 and $300,000 over 12 to 18 months before either giving up or the child aged out of the system." Catherine closed her laptop. This isn't bureaucratic incompetence, Damien. This is fraud. Systematic, calculated fraud designed to exploit wealthy people's emotional attachments to vulnerable children. Damien's jaw tightened. They're using Nalani as bait. Keeping her trapped so I'll keep paying. Exactly. And I'd bet every dollar I have that Vincent Hayes is getting kickbacks from Mrs. Monroe. She denies adoptions through him, convinces sponsors to pay directly to Riverside instead, they split the profits. The children never benefit. The state funding continues because the kids remain in the system. Everyone wins except the actual children. How do we prove it? Catherine smiled grimly. That's the hard part. We'd need documentation showing coordination between Hayes and Monroe. Bank records. Emails. Recorded conversations. Something that proves intent to defraud rather than just suspicious coincidences. Before Damien could respond, his phone rang. Nalani's name appeared on the screen. She'd been given a cell phone during one of his visits, though Mrs. Monroe had initially resisted, claiming it would disrupt facility rules. Nalani? What's wrong? He could hear the tears in her breathing before she spoke. I overheard Mrs. Monroe on the phone last night. She was talking to someone, she called him Hayes. She said, the adoption was denied just like you arranged. She said you'd keep paying to maintain access to me. That desperate billionaires are very profitable. Damien's blood ran cold. She said those exact words. Yes. And the person on the phone, Hayes, said to make sure you stay emotionally invested. That you're worth at least $200,000. Nalani's voice cracked. They're using me. They sabotaged your adoption so they could keep taking your money. I'm not a person to them. I'm just a thing they can profit from. Nalani, listen to me, Damien said urgently. You did exactly the right thing by calling. I need you to stay strong for a few more days. Can you do that? What if they find out I told you? What if they? They won't. I promise. Just act normal. Don't let Mrs. Monroe know you suspect anything. He looked at Catherine, who was already typing notes. Comment where you're watching from if you believe justice is coming. After hanging up, Damien turned to his lawyer. We have a witness. Nalani heard them discussing the fraud directly. A 12-year-old's testimony might not be enough, Catherine cautioned. Especially against an established DCF caseworker and a licensed facility director. They'll claim she misheard, misunderstood, or fabricated the story to help your adoption case. Then we get more evidence. Damien's voice hardened with determination. I want a private investigator. The best one available. Someone who specializes in exposing corruption. I know someone, Catherine said. Rebecca Torres. Former FBI agent, now works private sector investigating nonprofit fraud. If there's dirt to find, she'll find it. 2 days later, Rebecca Torres sat in Damien's office reviewing everything Catherine had compiled. She was 53 years old with short gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. 20 years with the FBI's white-collar crime division before retiring to private investigation. This pattern is textbook corruption, Rebecca said after 30 minutes of silence. Vincent Hayes has denied adoptions from Riverside at 3 times the rate of other DCF caseworkers handling similar facilities. Mrs. Monroe's facility receives double the average donations compared to similar-sized orphanages, but spending on actual child welfare is 40% below state minimums. Where's the money going? Damien asked. That's what I need to find out. I'll start with bank records, both personal and Riverside's operational accounts. Look for unexplained deposits, transfers between Hayes and Monroe, expenditures that don't match reported activities. I'll also interview former Riverside employees, other prospective adoptive parents who were denied, and children who've aged out of the system. How long will this take? 2 weeks for preliminary findings. Maybe 4 for a complete case. Rebecca met his eyes. But I need to be clear about something. If we expose this fraud, DCF will likely remove all children from Riverside immediately during the investigation. They'll be placed in temporary foster homes across the state. You won't have access to Nalani for months, possibly longer. The investigation will take priority over your adoption case. Damien felt the weight of that choice. Months without seeing Nalani. Months of her being moved between strangers, more trauma added to her already difficult life. The safe choice was to accept the sponsorship arrangement, keep paying, maintain contact even if it meant being exploited. But that would leave Mrs. Monroe and Hayes free to do this to other children. Other families. It would make him complicit in fraud by choosing silence over justice. My best friend died 5 years ago, Damien said quietly. I didn't know. Didn't reach out. Didn't keep my promise to her. Now her daughter is trapped in a system designed to exploit her. If I stay silent because it's easier, because it keeps me close to Nalani, I'm failing Elise again. And I'm teaching Nalani that comfort matters more than truth. He looked at Rebecca. Expose everything. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs me personally. These people are hurting children for profit. That ends. Now. Rebecca nodded with respect. I'll start immediately. Over the next 10 days, Rebecca worked with the efficiency of someone who'd built careers destroying corruption. She obtained bank records through legal channels, subpoenas issued by Catherine Park on behalf of Damien's fraud complaint. She interviewed 6 former Riverside employees who'd quit over ethical concerns. She tracked down 4 families who'd been denied adoptions and convinced to become sponsors instead. The evidence mounted like snow in a blizzard. Offshore accounts. Shell companies. Transfers between Hayes and Monroe totaling nearly $400,000 over 5 years. Falsified psychological evaluations claiming children had special needs, requiring expensive interventions. Inflated care costs billed to sponsors while actual spending remained minimal. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Subscribe, you won't believe what happens next. One of Rebecca's contacts at DCF, a caseworker who'd suspected Hayes for years but lacked proof, provided access to Hayes's work email through an official internal investigation. Buried in archived messages from 18 months ago was an email exchange between Hayes and Mrs. Monroe discussing monetization opportunities, with specific children listed by name, including detailed profiles of their potential sponsors' net worth and emotional vulnerability factors. Nalani's name was on that list. Next to it, Elise Carter connection makes sterling worth $250K minimum. They'd been planning to exploit Damien from the moment Nalani played that piano. Rebecca compiled everything into a comprehensive report. 73 pages of documentation proving systematic fraud, embezzlement, child exploitation, and conspiracy between a DCF caseworker and facility director. She delivered it to Damien on a rainy Thursday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after beginning the investigation. This is enough to end both their careers and put them in prison, Rebecca said. The question is what you want to do with it. We can take this to the media, the state attorney general, or DCF's internal affairs. Each option has different consequences. Damien stared at the report that would destroy Mrs. Monroe and Vincent Hayes. That would also separate him from Nalani for months. Maybe longer. He thought about Elise, playing Promise in that practice room 25 years ago. About the girl who'd kept playing even when money ran out and hope seemed impossible. He picked up his phone and called Catherine Park. File everything. With everyone. Media. Attorney General. DCF. FBI if necessary. I want this exposed completely. You understand what that means? It means I keep a 25-year-old promise, Damien said. Even if it costs me everything. The Boston Globe headline broke at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning. DCF caseworker and orphanage director accused of systematic fraud, children exploited for profit. By noon, every major news outlet in Massachusetts had picked up the story. By evening, it had gone national. Nalani learned about the explosion from the television in Riverside's common room. She stood frozen in her worn pajamas, watching her own face appear on screen, a photo from the charity auction, sitting at the Steinway grand piano. The crawl beneath read, 12-year-old orphan at center of adoption fraud scheme. Around her, the other 11 girls watched in stunned silence. Mrs. Monroe was nowhere to be seen. She'd been escorted from the building by state police at 7:15 that morning, her office sealed with crime scene tape. A temporary supervisor sent by DCF Emergency Services, a kind-faced woman named Angela Richardson, stood in the doorway, her expression heavy with the weight of bad news she'd have to deliver soon. "Girls," Angela said quietly. "I need everyone to sit down. We need to talk about what's happening." The 12 girls sat on mismatched couches and chairs donated years ago by people who'd wanted tax write-offs more than they'd wanted to help children. Nalani took a seat near the window, her stomach churning. The Massachusetts Department of Children and Families is conducting an emergency investigation into Riverside Home, Angela began. "Without going into details that are part of an ongoing criminal case, I need to tell you that Mrs. Monroe and a DCF caseworker named Vincent Hayes have been arrested on charges including fraud, embezzlement, and child welfare violations." One of the older girls, Destiny, 16, who'd been at Riverside for 4 years, raised her hand. "What does that mean for us?" "It means you'll be temporarily relocated while the investigation completes. We're arranging emergency foster placements across the Boston area. You'll be assigned to families who've been vetted and approved for short-term care. Your schools will be notified. Your belongings will be packed and moved with you. This will happen quickly, within the next 48 hours. Chaos erupted. Girls crying. Questions shouted over each other. Where would they go? Would they stay together? What about their things? What about school? What about? One at a time, Angela said, raising her hands for quiet. "I know this is scary. I know it's not fair that adults you should have been able to trust violated that trust. But I promise you, the families receiving you have been carefully screened. You'll be safe. And this is temporary. Once the investigation concludes, we'll work on permanent placements for everyone." Nalani barely heard the rest. Her mind was stuck on one word, temporary. How long was temporary? Weeks? Months? And what about Damien? Would she be able to see him? Or would the investigation mean more separation, more uncertainty, more adults making decisions about her life without asking what she wanted? Hit subscribe if you believe this story matters. 2 days later, Nalani sat in the back seat of Angela Richardson's car, everything she owned packed into 2 duffel bags. The other girls had been placed throughout the previous day, scattered to foster homes in Roxbury, Cambridge, Somerville, Quincy. Nalani was the last to be relocated, her placement complicated by the high-profile nature of the case. "Where am I going?" Nalani asked as they drove through Boston neighborhoods she didn't recognize. "A family in Newton. The Johnsons. They've fostered 6 children over the past 3 years, all short-term emergency placements. They're experienced, kind, and equipped to handle the media attention your case might attract." Angela glanced in the rearview mirror. "I want to be clear, Nalani. You didn't do anything wrong. You exposed something horrible. That took incredible courage. But I know it doesn't feel like courage right now. It probably feels like your life is falling apart again. Will I see Damien Sterling?" The question came out smaller than Nalani intended. Angela's expression softened with sympathy. "Not during the active investigation. The state has strict rules about contact between witnesses and potential adoptive parents in fraud cases. They need to ensure your testimony isn't influenced or appears influenced. Once the investigation concludes and if Mr. Sterling's adoption application is reproved, contact can resume. But that could take months. Nalani turned to look out the window, fighting tears. She'd done the right thing. She knew that. Exposing Mrs. Monroe and Hayes meant other children wouldn't be exploited the same way. But knowing something was right didn't make it hurt less. The Johnson house was a two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood where trees lined sidewalks and SUVs sat in driveways. Angela walked Nalani to the front door, rang the bell. A woman in her early 40s answered, white, with kind eyes and graying blonde hair pulled into a ponytail. "You must be Nalani. I'm Patricia Johnson. Please, come in." Inside smelled like cookies and laundry detergent. 3 other children were visible in the living room, 2 boys around 8 and 10, and a girl maybe 14. All foster kids, Nalani realized. All temporary residents in someone else's home. Patricia showed Nalani to a small bedroom on the second floor. Clean, plain, with a twin bed and empty dresser. A window overlooked the backyard where a tire swing hung from an oak tree. "I know this isn't home," Patricia said gently. "But I hope we can make you comfortable while you're here. We have dinner at 6. Homework time is 7 to 8:30. You're welcome to use the piano in the living room anytime. Angela mentioned you're a musician." Nalani's head snapped up. "You have a piano?" "An old upright. Hasn't been tuned in years, but it works. My daughter took lessons before she went to college. Now it just sits there waiting for someone to play it." After Patricia left, Nalani unpacked her 2 duffel bags. Clothes that didn't quite fit. Toiletries. School supplies. And at the bottom, wrapped carefully in a pillowcase, her mother's sheet music for Promise. She went downstairs and found the piano. An upright Yamaha, older but maintained, pushed against the living room wall beneath family photos of people who weren't Nalani's family and never would be. She sat at the bench, lifted the fallboard, touched the keys. Out of tune, yes, but responsive. Alive. Capable of making music. Nalani began to play. Not Promise, that felt too raw, too personal for this strange house. Instead, she played scales. Arpeggios. Technical exercises her mother had taught her years ago. Muscle memory taking over where emotion couldn't. The 2 younger boys appeared in the doorway, watching with wide eyes. Then the 14-year-old girl. Then Patricia, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Nalani played for 20 minutes, losing herself in the mathematics of music, intervals and progressions and harmonic relationships that made sense when nothing else did. When she finally stopped, her hands were shaking. "That was beautiful," Patricia said softly. "Truly beautiful. Thank you for letting me play," Nalani whispered. "Play anytime. The piano's been lonely." That night, Nalani lay in a bed that wasn't hers, in a room that wasn't hers, in a house where she was temporary. She thought about Damien, somewhere in Boston, unable to contact her. About the other Riverside girls scattered across the city. About Mrs. Monroe in jail. About everything that had exploded from one decision to tell the truth. Her mother's words echoed, "Promises are kept in choosing to believe anyway." 3 months passed. Nalani attended a new school where she knew nobody. She practiced on the Johnsons' piano every evening, the only constant in a life that felt entirely unstable. Angela Richardson visited monthly with updates. The investigation was progressing, evidence was overwhelming, criminal trials were being scheduled. But nothing about Damien. Nothing about adoption. Nothing about when temporary would become permanent. Then on a gray November afternoon, Angela arrived at the Johnson house with someone Nalani didn't recognize. A woman in her 50s with a DCF badge and a folder under her arm. "Nalani," Angela said, her expression unreadable. "This is Director Susan Martinez. She's taken over oversight of the entire DCF adoption division after the scandal. She has something important to discuss with you." Director Martinez sat across from Nalani at the kitchen table, opened her folder. "Subscribe now, Everything is about to change. Miss Carter, I want to start by apologizing on behalf of the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. You were failed by people who were supposed to protect you. That failure is unacceptable, and we're implementing system-wide reforms to ensure it never happens again. Okay, Nalani said quietly, unsure where this was going. Vincent Hayes and Patricia Monroe have been formally charged with 19 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and child welfare violations. They'll both face significant prison time. Our investigation uncovered 8 other children whose adoptions were deliberately sabotaged for profit. We're working to rectify those situations. Director Martinez pulled out another document. As for your case specifically, Damian Sterling's adoption application has been fully reviewed by new caseworkers with no connection to the previous fraud. His application is approved, Nalani. Pending your consent, the adoption can be finalized within 2 weeks. Nalani stopped breathing. What? Mr. Sterling wants to adopt you. Do you want to be adopted by him? 4 words. Simple question. The answer that would change everything. Nalani stared at Director Martinez across the Johnsons' kitchen table, the adoption approval document between them like a bridge connecting past trauma to possible future. 3 months of silence. 3 months of living with strangers and practicing piano alone and wondering if she'd lost the one person who'd known her mother. Now, suddenly, a question that should have been simple but felt impossibly complex. Do you want to be adopted by him? Yes, Nalani whispered. Then louder, yes. Absolutely yes. Director Martinez smiled, the first genuine warmth Nalani had seen from any DCF official in months. Then we'll start the finalization process immediately. Mr. Sterling has been waiting for this moment since September. He's been respectful of the investigation's requirements, but I know the separation has been difficult for him. For both of you. Can I see him? The question burst out desperately. Before the adoption finalizes? Just to talk to him. We can arrange a supervised meeting this week. At DCF offices, with a caseworker present to ensure proper protocol. Would Friday work? Nalani nodded so hard her neck hurt. 3 days later, she sat in a sterile conference room at the DCF downtown office, hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. Angela Richardson sat in the corner, present but trying to be invisible. The door opened. Damian Sterling looked older than Nalani remembered. More gray in his hair. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 months ago. He wore jeans and a sweater instead of his usual expensive suits, like he'd stopped caring about appearances and started caring only about what mattered. When he saw Nalani, his entire face transformed. Relief and joy and grief all mixed together. "Hi," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hi," Nalani replied. They stood awkwardly for a moment, 2 people who'd been through trauma together but were still essentially strangers. Then Damian crossed the room and pulled Nalani into a hug that felt like safety and promise and the father she'd never had all combined. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "Sorry you had to go through the investigation alone. Sorry I couldn't be there. Sorry it took so long. You exposed them," Nalani said into his shoulder. "Mrs. Monroe and Hayes. You got justice for me and the other kids. That matters more than 3 months." They sat down across from each other at the conference table. Angela remained in her corner, giving them privacy while maintaining protocol. "Tell me everything," Damian said. "How have you been? Where are you staying? Are they treating you okay?" Nalani told him about the Johnsons, kind people, good foster parents, but temporary. About the new school where she was the quiet girl nobody knew. About the out-of-tune piano she played every night until Patricia told her to stop because it was past 9. About carrying her mother's sheet music everywhere like a talisman. "Have you been able to practice? Really practice?" Damian asked. "Not like I need to. The piano at the Johnsons is okay for scales and simple pieces, but it's not good enough for serious work. And I don't have lessons anymore. Everything kind of stopped when Riverside closed. Damien's expression hardened with determination. That ends now. Director Martinez says the adoption can finalize in 2 weeks. The moment it's official, we're getting you into the Boston Conservatory's youth program. Best piano instructors in the state. Your mother studied there, they'll be honored to teach her daughter. What if I'm not good enough? The fear that had lived in Nalani's chest for 3 months finally found words. What if I've lost too much time? What if without real practice, I've forgotten how to play the way I used to? Nalani, you played Promise after 6 months without touching a piano and made a billionaire cry in front of 500 people. You haven't lost anything. You've just been waiting. Hit subscribe if you believe talent never dies. He reached across the table, took her hand. I made a promise to your mother 25 years ago. That I'd never forget what music could create. I broke that promise for 20 years. But you kept it for her. You kept playing even when nobody was listening. Even when the system tried to break you. That's not talent, Nalani. That's genius combined with courage most adults don't have. Tears ran down Nalani's face. I was so scared you'd forget about me. That you'd decide I wasn't worth the trouble. Forget you. Damien's voice cracked. I haven't thought about anything else for 3 months. I've reorganized my entire life around being ready for you. Cut my work schedule in half. Hired a family counselor to help us both navigate adoption transition. Converted my guest room into a bedroom for you, let you decorate it however you want once you move in. Bought a Steinway baby grand for the living room so you can practice anytime. You bought a Steinway. A baby grand. Not as big as the concert grand from the charity auction, but it's yours. Only yours. Nobody else plays it. He smiled through his own tears. Your mother once told me that music was the only thing that mattered in a world that tried to convince us everything else did. I didn't understand what she meant until I met you. Until I watched you play her promise to a room full of people who dismissed you as invisible. Angela Richardson cleared her throat gently. We need to wrap up soon. But I wanted to mention, the finalization hearing is scheduled for November 22nd. 2 weeks from today. Both of you will appear before a judge who'll officially approve the adoption. After that, Nalani, you'll move in with Mr. Sterling permanently. What do I call you? Nalani asked suddenly. After the adoption. Do I call you Damien? Or Dad? Or whatever feels right to you, Damien said immediately. There's no pressure. We'll figure it out together. The label doesn't matter as much as the relationship. The meeting ended too quickly. Angela escorted Nalani back to the Johnson house while Damien returned to his penthouse to continue preparing for the arrival of his daughter, not by blood, but by choice. By promise. By the kind of family that gets built from broken pieces instead of inherited. 2 weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness. Nalani counted days, then hours, then minutes. She practiced on the Johnsons' piano until her fingers ached, preparing pieces she'd play once she had access to Damien's Steinway. She packed and repacked her duffel bags, making sure her mother's sheet music was protected and accessible. The night before the finalization hearing, Patricia Johnson sat on the edge of Nalani's bed, her expression bittersweet. You're going to do great tomorrow, Patricia said. And Mr. Sterling is lucky to have you. Thank you for letting me stay here, Nalani said. For being kind even though I was temporary. Every child deserves kindness, temporary or not. But I'm glad you found permanent. You deserve that most of all. November 22nd arrived cold and clear. Nalani wore a new dress Damien had sent, deep purple, her mother's color, that actually fit properly. Angela drove her to the courthouse where Damien waited on the steps, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. Inside, they stood before Judge Rebecca Morrison, a black woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a reputation for taking child welfare cases seriously. She reviewed the paperwork, asked Nalani direct questions about whether she understood what adoption meant and whether this was what she wanted. "Yes, Your Honor," Nalani said clearly. "This is what I want." Judge Morrison looked at Damien. "Mr. Sterling, do you understand the lifelong commitment you're making? The responsibility of raising a child who's experienced significant trauma? The challenges of becoming a parent with no previous experience?" "I understand, Your Honor. And I'm ready. More ready than I've been for anything in my life." "Then by the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I hereby grant this adoption. Nalani Carter, you are now legally the daughter of Damien Sterling. Congratulations to you both." The gavel came down. "Subscribe, the journey is just beginning." In the courthouse hallway, Damien lifted Nalani in a hug that felt like the world rearranging itself into the shape it was always supposed to be. "Let's go home," he said. "Home," Nalani repeated, testing the word. It felt foreign and perfect all at once. They drove to Damien's penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor. 32nd floor. Windows offering views of water and sky. Space and light and luxury Nalani had never experienced. But the most beautiful thing in the entire apartment was in the living room. A Steinway baby grand piano. Black and gleaming. Positioned beside floor-to-ceiling windows where morning light would pour across the keys. Nalani walked to it slowly, reverently. Touched the polished surface. Sat at the bench. Placed her fingers on ivory keys that responded with perfect weight and tone. She began to play Promise. Her mother's composition. The piece that had started everything. This time, when Damien cried, they were tears of gratitude. For promises kept across 25 years. For a girl who refused to stay silent. For music that survived when everything else failed. Nalani Carter had a home. And Damien Sterling had learned what Elise had tried to teach him decades ago. The most important promises are the ones you keep even when no one's watching. Especially then. 1 year later, Nalani stood backstage at the Westfield Grand Theater, the same venue where everything had changed. She was 13 now, taller by 3 inches, her hair styled in elegant twists instead of the simple braids she'd worn as an orphan. The purple dress she wore was custom-made, designed specifically for this performance. Through the curtain, she could hear the audience settling into seats. Not 500 wealthy donors this time. Just 50 carefully selected guests, the other 7 children rescued from Mrs. Monroe's fraud scheme and their new families, Rebecca Torres who'd exposed the corruption, Catherine Park who'd fought the legal battles, Angela Richardson who'd guided them through the aftermath, and survivors of similar adoption fraud cases from across Massachusetts. Damien stood beside her in the wings, his hand on her shoulder. Nervous? Terrified, Nalani admitted. "What if I mess up?" "Then you mess up in front of people who love you. That's the beautiful thing about family, they stay even when you're not perfect." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Your mother would be so proud of who you've become." Nalani thought about the past year. Moving into Damien's penthouse and slowly learning to call it home. Starting at the Boston Conservatory's youth program where her instructors had gasped at her raw talent. Weekly therapy sessions to process abandonment, trauma, and the complex emotions of finding family after losing everything. Learning to trust that Damien wouldn't disappear, that love could be permanent, that she was allowed to take up space and have needs and be seen. Learning to be a daughter and let someone be a father. It hadn't been perfect. She'd had nightmares about Mrs. Monroe. Days when she'd pushed Damien away because accepting love felt more dangerous than staying guarded. Moments when the weight of everything, her mother's death, 5 years in foster care, the exploitation, the investigation, had crashed down and left her unable to breathe. But Damien had stayed. Through every nightmare. Every bad day. Every moment when Nalani tested whether he meant the promises he'd made. He'd stayed. 5 minutes, Miss Carter, the stage manager called. Nalani walked onto the stage. The Steinway concert grand sat center stage. The same piano she played a year ago when she was just an invisible orphan begging for a chance. She sat at the bench, adjusted her position, let her hands rest on the keys. The curtain rose. 50 people looked back at her with expressions of love and support instead of mockery and dismissal. In the front row, Damien sat beside 7 children whose lives had been changed because one 12-year-old had been brave enough to speak truth. Comment where you're watching from if this story moved you. Thank you for coming, Nalani said, her voice carrying across the intimate space. A year ago, I stood on this stage and played a song my mother wrote. A promise she made to herself, that beauty could survive even in hardship. Tonight, I'm playing it again. Not because I'm still suffering, but because the promise came true. She began to play, Promise. The same melody. The same harmonies. But transformed by everything that had happened since. The notes carried different meaning now, not just grief and loss, but healing and hope and the kind of love that chooses you when you have nothing left to offer but yourself. When she finished, the applause felt different than it had a year ago. Not the stunned response of strangers recognizing unexpected talent, but the warm celebration of family witnessing someone they loved coming home to herself. Afterward, Damien joined her on stage, carrying a framed document. This is the original sheet music to Promise, he said to the audience. Written by my best friend Elise Carter 25 years ago. She made me promise to never forget what music could create. I failed that promise for 20 years. But her daughter kept it for both of us. He turned to Nalani. Your mother's legacy isn't just the music she wrote. It's the courage you carry. The way you survived. The way you spoke truth when silence would have been easier. You taught me that some promises take a lifetime to keep, but they're worth every minute. Nalani hugged him, her father, chosen not by blood but by love that refused to give up. I think Mom would be happy, she whispered. I think she's been happy since the moment you asked to play that piano, Damien replied. That night, Nalani placed the framed sheet music on her bedroom wall. Beside it, a photo from the adoption finalization hearing, her and Damien, smiling like people who'd found each other across impossible odds. She'd started as an orphan nobody wanted. She'd become a daughter someone chose. Subscribe if you believe every child deserves this ending. And somewhere, Elise Carter was smiling. Because the promise survived. The music survived. And love, the kind built from broken pieces, survived most of all.